Hello, everyone, and welcome. I want to do a quick video synopsis of the lecture we had last night in assessment and testing. So that's what we're going to go over today. We're going to look at a very important topic that has shaped, in many cases, distorted the history of assessment and testing and counseling: the roles of racism and sexism. Understanding this history isn't about dwelling in the past. It's about seeing the roots of bias so we can recognize it, challenge it, and build more equitable practices moving forward. Psychological assessments has always been framed as a tool for measuring ability, aptitude, and personality. In counseling, we use these tests to help understand our client's strengths and challenges, but there are a critical truth we must face. These truths have never exited in a existence in a social vacuum. They were created, validated, and interpreted within societies shaped by racial hierarchies, gender norms, and systemic oppression. That means that the biases of those eras have often become baked into the instruments themselves. As we look at the history, let's begin in the 1900s, when intelligence tests emerged, particularly through figures like Alfred Binet and later Louis Tremaine. It was quickly co-opted to support ideas of racial superiority. Here in the United States, IQ tests were used to prove that white Anglo-Saxon populations were more intelligent than immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, and far more than African Americans and indigenous people and Latinos. These scores weren't just numbers. They were used to justify discrimination against immigrants, demonstrate the discriminatory immigration laws, segregation of schools, and a denial of educational opportunities. For an example, at Ellis Island, immigrants were given culturally loaded, language heavy tests. Those who did perform well, often because English wasn't their first language, was labeled as feeble minded and barred from entry. As time went on, eugenics was a weaponization of testing. This era coincided with the rise of the eugenics movement, which falsely claimed that intelligence and morality were purely hereditary. Testing data was manipulated to argue for sterilization programs targeting people of color, poor communities, and those with disabilities. Counseling as a profession was not immune. Many early vocational and aptitude tests reinforced the idea that African Americans were best suited for manual labor, limiting access to broader career paths. Sexism ran parallel to racism in testing history. Women, especially women of color, were often assessed with tools that assumed that they were less suited for leadership, science, or high skilled professions. Career interest inventories in the mid 20th century often contained gender items. For example, a woman's interest in nursing, teaching would be scored positively, but interest in engineering or law might be flagged as non traditional, sometimes even discouraged. In mental health assessments, women were overdiagnosed with disorders like hysteria or anxiety, reinforcing stereotypes of emotional instability. Men, on the other hand, were underdiagnosed with these same conditions due to norms about masculinity. Cultural biases in testing didn't always look overt. In many cases, it was often hidden in the context. Text items will often assume familiarity with white middle class experiences, questions about golf, sailing, or opera. For example, a client from rural or urban working class community or from a non-Western culture might be penalized for not knowing these references, even though it had nothing to do with actual ability. In the 1960s and 70s, civil rights advocates led to a greater scrutiny of bias assessments. court cases like Larry P. versus Rao in 1979 prohibited the use of IQ tests for placing African American children in special education in California due to racial bias and test design administration. Dr. Jorge Sanchez um, engineered and pioneered the creation of bilingual education, emphasizing that immigrant Latino students will perform way better if they were given a test that was in their native language. Today, we have culturally adapted instruments, more rigorously validation process, and awareness training for counselors. Yet the legacy of racism, sexism, and tests still linger. Biases can creep in through norm groups that don't represent all populations, through translation issues, and through the subjective interpretation of results. As counselors, we have both an ethical duty and the practical responsibility to ensure assessments are equitable, and that means selecting instruments validated for the population we serve, interpreting the scores in context of culture, language, and lived experience, advocating for the development of an inclusive assessment. The goal isn't just fairness, it's accuracy. And accuracy comes from honoring the humanity of people we assess. In closing, the history of racism and sexism in assessment is a reminder that our tools are only as just as the system that create and use them. When we know this history, we can break harmful cycles and ensure that our work in counseling truly supports rather than harms the clients who trust us. Thank you for listening, and let's continue to do the work and make assessments a tool for liberation, not oppression.